Before America became a nation of 50 states, superpower of the modern world, and symbol of freedom across continents, it was nothing more than a dream, fragile, uncertain, and nearly impossible. A dream that began with 13 small settlements stitched like beads along the Atlantic coastline. These colonies would one day unite to create a country unlike anything the world had seen before. But their story begins long before they imagined themselves as Americans. In the early 1600s, European empires scrambled for power, territory, and trade. Spain dominated the south. France controlled parts of the north. And the British, ambitious and hungry for influence, cast their eyes toward the vast unknown across the sea. It was here, on the very edge of the North American continent, that the story of the future United States began to take shape. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the first English colony to survive. It wasn't built on glory, it was built on desperation. Settlers arrived seeking wealth, but what they found instead was hunger, disease, conflict, and endless hardship. Many died. Many gave up. But those who stayed planted the first roots of England's foothold in the New World. This was not a land waiting to be claimed, it was already home to powerful Native American nations with deep cultures, rich agriculture, and complex societies. The meeting of these worlds would forever shape the destiny of the continent. And yet, despite every obstacle, the colonies grew. Soon came Massachusetts. Not for wealth. Not for gold. But for something far more powerful, belief. Puritans fleeing religious persecution sought a place where faith could be practiced freely, without fear of a king's command. Their arrival marked the beginning of a pattern that would define America, people crossing oceans in search of freedom. One colony became 2. 2 became 4. 10. 12. And finally 13. Each with its own identity, culture, and purpose. Virginia, built on agriculture and tobacco wealth. Maryland, founded as a haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania, born from Quaker ideals of peace and tolerance. The Carolinas, shaped by plantations and coastal trade. Georgia, intended as a refuge for debtors and the poor. 13 separate stories, yet destined to become one. Life in the colonies was not easy. Every day brought new challenges, shortages of food, harsh winters, threats of disease, and constant struggles over land and survival. But hardship forged resilience. And resilience forged identity. Generations passed. Children born in America grew up never knowing England as home. They spoke of our land, our towns, our future. Without realizing it, the colonists were becoming a new people, more independent, more confident, more determined than the empire that governed them. But across the ocean, the British Crown watched closely. By the mid-1700s, the British Empire faced enormous debt. Wars were expensive, colonies were demanding, and Britain saw its overseas territories as resources to be taxed, assets to be controlled. The Crown believed the colonies owed them obedience, loyalty, and money. The colonists did not agree. The first cracks in the relationship appeared with laws the colonists had no voice in creating. The Stamp Act. The Sugar Act. The Quartering Act. Suddenly, every document, every newspaper, every legal paper, even playing cards, required a British stamp. And that stamp came with a price. To the Crown, it was normal taxation. To the colonists, it was a warning. The phrase became a battle cry. The colonists demanded a voice in Parliament, but Britain refused. The colonies, they said, were subjects, not citizens. This idea, this refusal, lit a spark that would ignite an entire revolution. In taverns and meeting houses, ordinary men and women debated the future. In crowded ports and busy streets, anger simmered. Everyone, from farmers to merchants to intellectuals, felt the pressure of a king who lived thousands of miles away yet controlled every aspect of their daily lives. And then, came the moment that changed everything. March 5, 1770. Boston streets were cold. Tensions were colder. British soldiers stood guard in the city, enforcing laws the people despised. On that night, a crowd gathered, angry, frustrated, tired of being ignored. Snowballs turned to stones. Arguments turned to shouts. Shouts turned to violence. Soldiers fired. 5 colonists fell. This tragedy, known as the Boston Massacre, spread across the colonies like wildfire. Newspapers portrayed it as a brutal attack on innocent citizens. The story fueled anger, unity, and determination. The British intended to keep the colonies in line. Instead, they pushed them closer together. 3 years later, in 1773, another spark erupted. The British imposed a tax on tea, one of the colony's most essential goods. But this time, the colonists had had enough. A group known as the Sons of Liberty devised a plan that would shake the empire. Dressed as Mohawk Indians to hide their identities, they boarded ships in Boston Harbor under the cover of darkness. Crates of tea, worth millions today, were smashed open and thrown into the icy waters below. As the tea spread across the harbor, so did the message. We will not be controlled. Britain was outraged. Punishments followed. Harbors were closed, governments restricted, rights removed. But instead of breaking the colonies, these measures united them even more. Delegates from every colony gathered in Philadelphia. Farmers, lawyers, merchants, teachers, ordinary people with extraordinary vision, sat together to discuss the future. Could 13 different regions truly unite? Could farmers in Virginia share a purpose with merchants in Massachusetts? Could people from different religions, different economies, different worlds, come together? The answer would change history. For the first time, the colonies recognized that they were stronger together than apart. And in this unity, the idea of America was born. By 1774, the colonies stood at a crossroads. For decades, they had lived under British authority, sometimes guided by it, sometimes restricted by it, always shaped by decisions made across an ocean. But now, with their rights shrinking and their freedom threatened, the 13 colonies began to see themselves not as separate territories, but as one people facing the same struggle. In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress met to decide the fate of the colonies. Delegates debated intense questions. Could they negotiate peace? Should they resist British laws? Was war inevitable? Some wanted reconciliation. Others believed the time for words had passed. But all agreed on one thing. The colonies must stand together. They drafted a Declaration of Rights, demanding fair treatment and representation. But the British Crown answered not with understanding, but with more force. British troops were ordered to suppress rebellion. Governors were replaced. Colonial governments were dissolved. Every move, every response, pushed the colonies toward a future none could avoid. Revolution. April 19, 1775. A cold morning dawned on the small villages of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. British troops marched to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But the colonists were ready. Paul Revere and other riders raced through the night shouting a warning that would echo across history. The British are coming. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, ordinary citizens, grabbed muskets and formed militias. The green at Lexington was quiet as the British approached. Then, a single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. But that shot, the shot heard round the world, began the American Revolution. Colonists fought bravely, forcing the British to retreat all the way back to Boston. What began as a weapons search ended as a full-scale battle. The colonies were now at war. When the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, the situation was clear: the colonies needed leadership. They needed structure. They needed an army. Enter George Washington, a tall, quiet, commanding figure from Virginia. A man who had known war, who understood discipline, and who possessed a calm resolve that inspired confidence. The Congress chose him as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepted the role with humility. He knew the challenges ahead. His troops lacked uniforms, weapons, training, supplies, and experience. The British Army was the strongest in the world. The odds were nearly impossible. But Washington believed in something stronger than any empire. The idea that ordinary people could fight for their own destiny. The first major challenge came at Boston. British soldiers were trapped inside the city, surrounded by colonial forces. For months, the siege dragged on, cold nights, hunger, disease, and endless waiting. Then came a moment of brilliance. Henry Knox, a young officer, devised a daring plan: transport cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness to Boston. The journey was brutal. Snow, ice, mountains, rivers. But Knox succeeded. When Washington positioned those cannons on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the British-controlled city, everything changed. Realizing they could be destroyed, the British evacuated Boston. For the first time, the colonists won a major victory. For the first time, hope spread across the colonies. But even with growing hope, the colonies still had no clear answer to the greatest question of all. Were they fighting for rights, or for independence? Some urged caution. Many still felt loyalty to the crown. Breaking away entirely seemed dangerous, reckless, even impossible. Then, a simple pamphlet transformed the nation. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a bold argument for independence. He wrote with passion, clarity, and urgency. He spoke not to scholars or elites, but to farmers, workers, and families. His words spread like fire. It is time to break free. A continent should not be ruled by an island. We have the power to begin the world over again. For the first time, the idea of a truly independent America felt not like a dream, but like destiny. In June 1776, the Continental Congress made a decision that would forever change the course of history. They formed a committee to draft a document, a declaration explaining to the world why the colonies were breaking away from Britain. Chosen to write the first draft was a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. For 17 intense days, Jefferson wrote and revised, crafting the most powerful expression of human freedom ever recorded. His words were bold, revolutionary, unprecedented. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. These were not just statements, they were a challenge to every empire, every monarchy, every chain of oppression. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. On July 4, they approved the final text. And the Declaration of Independence was born. The colonies were no longer colonies. They were now the United States of America. Bells rang. Crowds cheered. Soldiers celebrated. But everyone knew the truth. Declaring independence was the easy part. Winning it would cost everything. The British Empire responded with overwhelming force. Ships filled the horizon. Thousands of troops landed in New York. Their message was clear: the rebellion would be crushed. Washington's army faced staggering odds. They had fewer men, less training, weak supplies, no navy, and no guarantee of survival. But they had something more powerful than fear: the belief that freedom was worth fighting for. The early battles were devastating. Washington's army was pushed back, city after city. New York was lost. Morale dropped. Winter loomed. For many, the dream of freedom was beginning to fade. But in moments of darkness, history often reveals its greatest heroes. Winter. The season that tests the strength of armies, and the spirit of nations. By late 1776, the Continental Army was exhausted. Outmanned, outgunned, and nearly out of hope. Washington's troops had suffered defeat after defeat. Supplies were gone. Clothes were torn. Many soldiers had no shoes, only rags wrapped around frozen feet. Some had deserted. Many believed the revolution was dying. Britain celebrated early victory. Newspapers in London declared that the rebellion would soon collapse. But they underestimated one thing: the resolve of a people fighting for their freedom. On Christmas night, 1776, while British soldiers slept in warm quarters across the river, Washington made a bold decision that would revive the Revolution. He ordered his troops to cross the icy Delaware River. In the darkness, in freezing winds, through ice-choked waters. This was not a simple maneuver, it was a gamble with the future of America itself. Sound, ice cracking, oars pushing in water. For hours, men paddled silently in heavy boats. Snow cut through the air. Ice scraped against wood. But they pressed forward, driven by a belief stronger than hunger, stronger than cold, stronger than fear. When dawn broke, Washington's army launched a surprise attack on Trenton, capturing nearly all the enemy forces. This victory sent shockwaves through the colonies. Hope returned. The Revolution lived. 1777 brought one of the most decisive battles of the entire war, Saratoga. The British planned to split the colonies in half by marching south from Canada. But American forces stood firm. They fought fiercely, determined not to let the heart of the rebellion be cut apart. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. For the first time, the Americans proved they could defeat the world's strongest army. And far across the ocean, another great power took notice. France. Impressed by the American resilience, the French agreed to join the fight. Their navy, their money, and their troops would soon tip the balance of the war. What began as a scattered colonial rebellion was now an international struggle for freedom. But victory did not come without sacrifice. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, enduring one of the harshest winters in American history. Nearly 12,000 soldiers built shelters from logs and mud. Food was scarce. Disease spread. Frostbite claimed limbs. For many, survival seemed impossible. Yet, this bitter winter forged something extraordinary. A Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben arrived to train the troops. He drilled them daily, teaching discipline, precision, formation, and organization. He transformed a starving, freezing militia into a professional fighting force. By spring, the Continental Army that emerged from Valley Forge was no longer a scattered group of volunteers. It was a unified, disciplined army, ready to face anything Britain threw at them. Valley Forge had not broken them. It had made them stronger. As battles raged in the north, the war expanded to the south. Cities fell. Homes burned. Families fled. The British tried to turn southern colonies against the rebellion, but instead they sparked a fierce resistance. Farmers, hunters, and frontiersmen formed militias and fought guerrilla style, ambushing British patrols, disrupting supply lines, and vanishing into forests. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, became symbols of this unconventional warfare. His hit-and-run attacks frustrated British troops and weakened their control. The war was no longer fought in open fields alone. It was fought in swamps, forests, mountains, and farmlands. It was fought by soldiers, farmers, women, children, by an entire people determined to claim their independence. Across Europe, nations watched with fascination. Could a group of colonists truly defy an empire? France had already joined. Spain and the Netherlands supported the cause financially. Volunteers from across the world came to fight for American freedom. Lafayette from France. Pulaski from Poland. Kosciuszko from Lithuania. De Kalb from Germany. This was no longer just a war for land. It was a war for the future of human liberty. Despite early dominance, Britain faced growing challenges. Fighting far from home drained British resources. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles across the ocean. British tactics were often rigid, designed for European battlefields. The American spirit proved impossible to crush. Global alliances strengthened the revolutionary cause. The British won battles, but could not extinguish the idea of freedom. They controlled cities, but not the countryside. They won ground, but lost support. They occupied land, but could not conquer hearts. The war dragged on, costly and complex. By 1781, British General Cornwallis moved his forces to Yorktown, Virginia. He believed the British Navy would supply and protect him. But Washington saw a chance to end the war. He marched his army south, while French General Rochambeau joined him with reinforcements. At the same time, the French Navy sailed to block the British fleet. Cornwallis was trapped. For days, American and French artillery pounded British defenses. The sky filled with smoke. The ground shook with cannon fire. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in trenches. Cornwallis realized it was over. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army. The war was effectively won. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States of America as a free, independent nation. From 13 fragile colonies, a new country had risen. A republic built not on bloodlines or kings, but on ideas. On freedom. On the belief that people could govern themselves. The world would never be the same again. By the mid-1700s, something subtle but powerful was emerging within the colonies, an identity that was no longer fully British, yet not fully American either. It was a space in between, an invisible bridge between two worlds. Colonists still spoke English, traded with English merchants, and pledged loyalty to an English king. But day by day, year by year, the distance between them was widening. The colonies had grown too large, too independent, and too ambitious to remain forever under Britain's shadow. This transformation was not sudden, it was a slow-burning fire. And the spark that ignited it came not from the battlefield, but from the mind. Long before muskets were fired and flags raised, the revolution began quietly, in sermons, in pamphlets, in taverns, in secret meetings where the air carried whispers of a dangerous idea. What if people could govern themselves? This was the era of Enlightenment, a period when thinkers across Europe challenged old systems and proposed radical new beliefs. These ideas traveled across oceans, carried in books that arrived at colonial ports, read by merchants, ministers, and students hungry for knowledge. Names like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau began to circulate in conversation. Their message was electrifying. Governments exist to serve the people. People have natural rights, life, liberty, property. If a government becomes abusive, the people have the right to change it. These were not just thoughts, they were dynamite. The colonists began to see their world differently. The monarchy, once seen as an unquestioned authority, now appeared flawed, distant, even unjust. Every unfair tax, every decree from London, every decision made without colonial voice felt like a violation of their emerging rights. The ground beneath the colonies was shifting. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Britain faced its own troubles. Wars were expensive. The empire was vast. And running colonies required money the crown believed the colonists should provide. So Parliament imposed new laws. The Sugar Act, taxing imported goods. The Currency Act, controlling colonial money. The Quartering Act, forcing colonists to house British soldiers. The Stamp Act, placing taxes on paper, newspapers, contracts, even playing cards. To London, these laws were reasonable. To the colonists, they felt like chains. And the most painful part? No one across the sea asked them. No colony had a representative in Parliament. No voice. No vote. The colonists had a name for this injustice. Taxation without representation. And it became the heartbeat of resistance. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and towns across the coast, the people gathered, merchants, farmers, lawyers, dockworkers, ordinary citizens forced into extraordinary times. Taverns became meeting places. Churches became political stages. Streets became arenas for loud, fearless debate. Groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, ordinary men with extraordinary bravery. They spoke boldly against the crown. They organized boycotts of British goods. They wrote articles calling for the defense of American rights. For the first time, colonists from different regions, who once thought of themselves as Virginians, or Pennsylvanians, or New Englanders, began to speak a common language. A language of unity. A language of defiance. A language of freedom. Then came the night of March 5, 1770, a night carved into the American memory. British soldiers, tense and surrounded, fired into an angry crowd in Boston. 5 colonists fell. Blood stained the white snow. The incident echoed through the colonies like thunder. Paul Revere engraved it. Newspapers printed it. Ministers preached about it. For many, it confirmed their growing fear: Britain was willing to kill to maintain control. The line between colony and empire was beginning to crack. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, a move designed not only to control trade, but to force colonists to accept the authority of Parliament. But the colonists would not bend. On a cold December night, a group of men disguised as Mohawk warriors climbed aboard ships in Boston Harbor. They broke open chests of British tea and dumped them into the water, turning the harbor into a dark pool of rebellion. The Boston Tea Party was not just protest. It was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand. Britain responded with fury. Punishment came swiftly, closing the port of Boston, rewriting colonial governments, increasing troop presence. These were known as the Intolerable Acts, and they pushed the colonies toward a point of no return. By 1774, 12 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia. For the first time in history, representatives from almost all the colonies gathered under one roof to discuss their future. They debated intensely. They clashed. They argued. But in the end, they agreed on one thing. The colonies must stand together. They formed a unified response. They planned boycotts. They declared their rights. And they prepared, quietly, for the possibility of war. The seeds of a new nation were being planted, yet the world did not know it. Even the delegates themselves could not fully imagine the magnitude of what they were building. But destiny was already in motion. By early 1775, the conflict had become unavoidable. British troops marched to seize colonial weapons stored outside Boston. But the colonists were ready. Militias, ordinary farmers turned soldiers, waited. At Lexington, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. But history remembers it as the shot heard around the world. At Concord, colonial militias forced the British to retreat. The war had begun. Not a war for land. Not a war for power. But a war for a dream still fragile, still uncertain, but worth everything. War had broken out. But the colonies were not yet a nation. They were 13 separate entities, each with its own government, its own interests, its own fears. What they needed now was direction. Leadership. Unity. And above all, a symbol. When the Continental Congress gathered again in 1775, one man stood taller than the rest, literally and figuratively. A veteran of the French and Indian War, known for bravery and discipline, dressed in a modest blue and buff uniform he had designed himself. George Washington. He did not seek power. He did not ask for command. Yet, the room sensed something unmistakable: strength, humility, and a quiet determination. John Adams rose and nominated Washington to lead the Continental Army. Washington's response? "I do not think myself equal to the command." And yet, he accepted. That moment marked the rise of a leader who would guide the colonies through the darkest storm in their history. What Washington inherited was not truly an army. It was a collection of farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, and merchants, brave but untrained, passionate but poorly equipped. Some had no uniforms. Some shared muskets. Many had never fired a gun before the war. But they had something more powerful than any weapon: belief. Washington transformed them. He imposed discipline, structure, training. He turned chaos into cohesion. And slowly, the Continental Army became a force that could challenge the world's most powerful empire. The colonies were fighting a war without a government, without international recognition, and without stable funding. Soldiers lacked food. Muskets were scarce. Gunpowder ran dangerously low. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress. Without supplies, the army must disband. But Congress itself was weak and broke. They had no system of taxation, no treasury, no authority. They were building a government while fighting for their existence. Every victory was earned through sacrifice. Every step forward required unimaginable determination. Then, out of nowhere, came a voice that ignited the hearts of millions: Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England, who believed the colonies deserved better. In January 1776, he published a small pamphlet with a big title: Common Sense. Its message was as clear as it was revolutionary. America must be independent. Kings were outdated and dangerous. Freedom was not a privilege, it was a right. Paine wrote with fire. His words spread like a storm. Taverns read it aloud. Churches preached it. Farmers and merchants debated it. For the first time, the idea of a fully independent United States felt not only possible, but necessary. Common sense did not just inspire revolution. It gave it purpose. By late spring 1776, the colonies faced the most important decision in their history. Should they formally break from Britain? Some delegates were ready. Others feared war, chaos, economic collapse. Independence was not a simple choice, it was a leap into the unknown. The debates were long and emotional. John Adams argued fiercely for freedom. The time has come to dissolve the political bands which have connected us to Britain. Opponents warned of disaster. We face the greatest military force on earth. Defeat may bring the gallows. For days, the room pulsed with tension. But the direction of history was shifting. One voice remained quiet but powerful: Thomas Jefferson. A young Virginian with a gift for writing. Congress tasked him with a monumental responsibility. Write a declaration. A document that would announce the birth of a new nation. Jefferson wrote quickly, absorbed, relentless, inspired. In a small rented room in Philadelphia, he drafted sentences that would echo for centuries. Words that captured not just the hopes of the colonies, but the dreams of humanity. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal. He outlined the rights of people. Life. Liberty. The pursuit of happiness. He listed the crimes of King George III, describing how Britain had violated rights and ignored pleas for justice. He argued, with clarity and force, that the colonies had the right, and the duty, to dissolve their connection to Britain. This was not just a list of grievances. It was a declaration of the human spirit. On July 2, 1776, Congress gathered to vote. One by one, the colonies cast their decision. New Hampshire, yes. Massachusetts, yes. Virginia, yes. Georgia, yes. Unanimously. The United States of America was born in spirit. But 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, the official Declaration of Independence was adopted and approved. John Hancock signed first, large and bold. Others followed. Outside, the Liberty Bell rang. Crowds cheered. People wept. They were no longer colonists. They were Americans. The path ahead was uncertain. Victory was not guaranteed. Danger loomed at every turn. But the colonies had taken the most courageous step in their history. They declared themselves free. America was now an idea, bold, fragile, revolutionary. It existed on paper. It existed in hope. But it had yet to exist on the battlefield. The British Empire would not accept this declaration. They prepared to crush the rebellion swiftly and mercilessly. The war was far from over. The hardest chapters were still ahead. But something impossible had begun. 13 separate colonies had united as one. A nation built not on royalty, not on power, not on conquest, but on the belief that freedom belongs to every human being. And that belief would change the world. With independence declared, the fledgling United States was still far from secure. Across the Atlantic, Britain refused to accept the colonies' bold claim. They dispatched seasoned generals, disciplined troops, and powerful naval forces to crush the rebellion and restore order. For the Americans, the path forward was treacherous. The Continental Army, still young, inexperienced, and poorly supplied, faced the full might of the British Empire. In the summer of 1776, British forces landed on Long Island. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Washington's army suffered a series of defeats. Brooklyn, Manhattan, and ultimately New York City fell to the British. The losses were devastating. Homes burned. Civilians fled. For the soldiers, morale was at an all-time low. Washington knew a direct confrontation would be fatal. He executed a daring nighttime retreat across the East River, a maneuver that saved much of his army from destruction. It was a quiet act of genius in a campaign full of chaos, a reminder that leadership in war often required patience as much as courage. By December 1776, hope was dim. Many soldiers had completed their enlistments, hungry, barefoot, and cold. Desertions increased. Congress feared the revolution was collapsing. Washington needed a bold stroke to revive the fight. And he found it. On Christmas night, in the dead of winter, Washington led his men across the ice-choked Delaware River. Boats groaned under the weight of soldiers and artillery, snow and wind cutting across the river. For hours, the army endured bitter cold, pushing forward toward Trenton, New Jersey. At dawn, the Continental Army struck the unsuspecting Hessian forces. Victory came swiftly and decisively. This daring maneuver changed the course of the revolution. The army's morale soared. The people regained hope. The world began to take notice. The American rebellion was far from defeated. 1777 brought the Battle of Saratoga, one of the most pivotal moments of the war. British General Burgoyne aimed to cut the colonies in two by advancing south from Canada. But American forces, reinforced by local militias and clever tactics, stopped him. The surrender of Burgoyne's army was more than a military victory, it was symbolic. It proved that the Americans could defeat the mightiest army on earth. And it persuaded France to enter the war openly, providing soldiers, ships, and supplies. Spain and the Netherlands would soon follow, turning the revolution into an international struggle. From despair had come hope. From scattered militias had emerged a force capable of challenging an empire. Yet victory came at a cost. Winter of 1777 to 1778 found Washington's army encamped at Valley Forge. 12,000 men suffered through bitter cold, disease, and hunger. Many lacked shoes, coats, or even blankets. Families sent what little they could, but the army's survival depended on endurance and leadership. Washington remained resolute, encouraging his men, visiting tents, writing letters of hope. During this dark winter, Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrived. He drilled the men, instilling discipline, teaching European formations, and turning ragged militias into a professional army. By spring, they emerged stronger, more cohesive, and ready to face the British once again. Valley Forge was more than a winter camp. It was a crucible that forged an army capable of winning freedom. The war was fought not only in open battles but in forests, swamps, and homes across the colonies. Local militias harassed British supply lines. Farmers and frontiersmen became guerrilla fighters. Leaders such as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the enemy. His hit-and-run tactics frustrated British forces and inspired colonial resistance. Every skirmish, every small victory, strengthened the spirit of independence. The people, ordinary yet determined, had become participants in history. The war was no longer only about armies. It was a war of communities, families, and ideas. It was a revolution of the mind as well as the sword. By 1781, British General Cornwallis fortified his position at Yorktown, Virginia, believing the British Navy would support him. But Washington, with French General Rochambeau and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, orchestrated a brilliant strategy. The Continental and French armies surrounded Cornwallis on land, while the French blocked the Chesapeake by sea. Trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis had no escape. Days of bombardment, artillery fire, and relentless pressure forced the British to surrender. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis formally gave up. The dream of independence, once fragile and uncertain, had become reality. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. Borders were established. Rights were acknowledged. The 13 colonies, once weak, divided, and fragile, had transformed into a unified nation. The birth of the United States was more than the end of a war. It was the triumph of vision, perseverance, and courage. Ordinary men and women had built an extraordinary nation. A nation that would inspire generations to come. From Jamestown to Georgia, from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, the 13 colonies were the building blocks of freedom. Each colony contributed its unique culture, economy, and ideals. Together, they taught the world that a collection of small settlements, driven by shared vision and relentless courage, could unite to create something larger than themselves. The birth of America was not inevitable. It was fragile. It was dangerous. It was revolutionary. But it proved one enduring truth. When people believe in freedom, no empire can contain them. Victory on the battlefield did not instantly make America a nation. Independence had been declared, the British had surrendered, and borders were recognized, but the 13 former colonies faced a new, daunting challenge: how to govern themselves. They were no longer fighting for freedom from Britain, they were now fighting to create a country where freedom could survive. Immediately after the war, the Continental Congress acted to unite the states under a single governing framework. In 1781, the Articles of Confederation were ratified. It was a bold first step. For the first time, the 13 states agreed to operate under a common government. But the Articles were limited. They gave Congress authority to wage war and negotiate treaties, but little else. There was no power to tax, no executive branch, no central authority to enforce decisions. The new nation was independent, but fragile. The states soon discovered that unity was easier to declare than to achieve. Trade disputes flared. Borders remained unclear. Each state pursued its own interests. Some refused to contribute to national defense or pay war debts. Farmers and veterans protested unpaid wages. The economy faltered. Shays' Rebellion in 1786–87 became a wake-up call. Farmers in Massachusetts, burdened by debt and high taxes, took up arms. The rebellion underscored the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and convinced leaders that a stronger federal government was essential. Independence had been won on the battlefield, but the survival of the nation depended on governance, compromise, and vision. In 1787, delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The goal: create a government that balanced power between the states and a central authority, while protecting individual freedoms. Among the delegates were some of America's most brilliant minds. George Washington, chosen to preside over the convention. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who envisioned the framework for checks and balances. Benjamin Franklin, the wise elder, providing counsel and compromise. Alexander Hamilton, the fiery advocate for a strong national government. The convention was filled with debate, argument, and tension. Large states demanded representation based on population, small states demanded equality. North and South clashed over slavery and trade. Each word, each clause, was hard-fought. Yet through compromise and vision, the delegates drafted a document that would endure for centuries. The United States Constitution. Even as the Constitution was signed in 1787 and sent to the states for ratification, concern remained: would citizens retain individual freedoms under a strong central government? To address these concerns, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were ratified in 1791. These amendments guaranteed fundamental freedoms. Freedom of speech, religion, and press. The right to bear arms. Protection against unlawful search and seizure. Rights of the accused in criminal trials. The Bill of Rights ensured that independence was not just political, it was personal. Freedom would not only separate the colonies from Britain but protect the rights of every American citizen. In 1789, the new nation faced its most symbolic and critical moment, the inauguration of its first president. George Washington, whose leadership had guided the colonies through revolution, now faced the challenge of uniting a fledgling government. Taking office in New York City, the temporary capital, Washington's leadership set precedents for all who followed. He refused to seize power. He refused to create a monarchy. Instead, he emphasized the importance of democracy, humility, and service. His presidency was a living symbol. The dream of the 13 colonies had transformed into a functioning republic. Even after independence, the United States remained a nation of contrasts. Economies varied from industrial centers in the north to plantation-based agriculture in the south. Cultures, religions, and ideas were diverse. Slavery remained a deep, unresolved issue. The challenge was not merely creating a government, but forming a shared identity. What did it mean to be an American? What principles could bind the states together? These questions would continue to shape the nation for generations. Yet the foundation laid by the 13 colonies, unity in diversity, belief in freedom, and courage in adversity, remained strong. The story of the 13 colonies reverberated far beyond North America. Across Europe and Latin America, people studied the American struggle, inspired by the bold assertion of liberty and equality. The Revolution demonstrated that ordinary people, guided by ideas and principles, could challenge the most powerful empires on earth. France would follow with its own revolution. Latin American nations would rise in the 19th century. The American experiment became a symbol, a beacon of possibility, and proof that freedom could be fought for and achieved. From Jamestown's survival struggles to Massachusetts' religious freedoms, from Virginia's plantations to Pennsylvania's Quaker ideals, the 13 colonies laid the foundation of a nation built on courage, resilience, and shared purpose. They faced enormous challenges: war, famine, disease, political uncertainty, but they endured. They united not for glory, not for wealth, but for an ideal, the right to govern themselves and to shape their destiny. The United States of America, born from 13 fragile colonies, emerged as a nation with a new identity, a new hope, and a new vision. And the world would never be the same again. The war for independence had been won. The 13 colonies had transformed into a new nation. But victory in battle was only the beginning. The real challenge now lay in building a functioning society, a government, an economy, and a culture that could sustain freedom and prosperity for generations. The young United States faced a world dominated by established powers. Recognition by foreign nations was crucial for trade, security, and legitimacy. American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked tirelessly in Europe, negotiating the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. Borders were defined, and colonies' claims to Western territories were acknowledged. France, Spain, and the Netherlands maintained alliances, providing support and demonstrating that the American Revolution had reshaped global politics. The world had begun to see America not as rebellious colonies, but as a sovereign nation. Independence came with economic challenges. During the war, trade had been disrupted, cities had been damaged, and debts accumulated. The young government needed to stabilize the economy while creating systems for taxation, currency, and commerce. States experimented with their own currencies, tariffs, and trade policies. Merchants reopened ports, farmers expanded production, and entrepreneurs took risks to rebuild industries. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, would later propose a bold plan to establish national credit, assume state debts, and create a central bank, a blueprint for American economic stability. Even in these early years, the United States began to prove that independence was not just political, it could be practical, sustainable, and forward-looking. Despite the British withdrawal, threats persisted. Native alliances, European rivals, and pirate activity in international waters reminded Americans that freedom required vigilance. Washington emphasized a small standing army and a militia system while balancing the need to avoid a permanent military that could threaten liberty. The Northwest Territory became a testing ground for defense and governance. Settlers, often on the frontier of the new nation, relied on militias for protection. These early security measures laid the foundation for a citizen-soldier tradition that would endure in American society. The early republic faced profound questions. How much power should the federal government hold? What rights should remain exclusively with the states? How would citizens participate in governance? Debates gave rise to political factions. Federalists, led by Hamilton, argued for a strong national government. Anti-Federalists, including Jefferson, feared centralized power and championed state rights. Through debate, compromise, and negotiation, the Constitution held. It created a system of checks and balances, preventing any single branch or faction from dominating. This careful structure allowed freedom to coexist with order, an enduring principle of American governance. The 13 colonies had always been diverse in religion, culture, and education. This diversity became a strength of the new nation. Schools reopened. Colleges expanded. Newspapers proliferated, spreading ideas and connecting communities. The press became a cornerstone of freedom, enabling citizens to debate ideas openly. Literature, philosophy, and science flourished. The American identity, distinct from Britain, began to take shape in language, values, and civic participation. Women, though largely excluded from formal political power, contributed in essential ways, managing farms, businesses, and households during the war, and helping to establish civic institutions in peace. Their role in the Revolution laid the foundation for future social change. Independence also meant opportunity. The vast lands to the west of the original colonies represented both promise and challenge. Settlers pushed beyond the Appalachians, encountering Native American nations whose land had been claimed by treaty or conquest. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established a process for creating new states from Western territories, demonstrating that the United States intended to expand in an organized, legal manner. Education, religion, and rights were encouraged in these new regions, reflecting the principles of the original colonies. Expansion would define America's growth for centuries, and it began in these early post-revolutionary years. From rebellion to independence, from fragile governance to the establishment of law and order, the spirit of the 13 colonies remained the guiding light of the new nation. Courage, resilience, and a belief in liberty had transformed ordinary settlements into a country capable of self-rule. The struggle had tested every generation, but it also created something unique, a nation founded not on tradition, not on monarchy, not on conquest, but on principles, ideals, and human dignity. The lessons of the 13 colonies, unity in diversity, courage in adversity, the pursuit of justice, became the enduring foundation of America. In these years following independence, the United States faced challenges that would define its character: political debate, economic recovery, territorial expansion, and the task of building a national identity. From the Atlantic coast to the western frontier, the country began to imagine what it could become. A democracy. A republic. A beacon of freedom for the world. By the 1790s, the United States was no longer merely a collection of colonies, it was a nation under the Constitution. But independence had not eliminated challenges. New governments had to function. Borders had to be protected. Economies had to stabilize. And the young nation had to assert its place in a world dominated by older, more powerful empires. The revolution had ended, but the work of nation-building had only begun. The framers of the Constitution had designed a system to balance power. The executive branch, led by the president, would enforce laws. The legislative branch, Congress, would create them. And the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court, would interpret them. Checks and balances were designed to prevent tyranny, ensuring that no individual or institution could dominate the government. Washington, as the first president, became the embodiment of this balance. He navigated the new system with caution and wisdom, establishing precedents that would define the office: voluntary relinquishment of power, impartiality, and a commitment to the Constitution over personal ambition. The first political factions emerged almost immediately. Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, advocated for a strong central government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, supported limited federal authority, stronger states' rights, and closer ties with France. Debate was fierce, sometimes bitter, but it demonstrated that the new republic could survive disagreement. Political parties, though contentious, became a mechanism for public participation and representation, an innovation in governance that would shape American democracy for centuries. The economy of the post-revolutionary United States was fragile. War debts loomed. Trade had been disrupted. Manufacturing was minimal. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, proposed bold reforms. The federal government would assume state debts, consolidating national responsibility. A national bank would stabilize currency and provide credit. Tariffs and incentives would support American industry. These measures were controversial. Jefferson feared centralized power. Farmers worried about taxes. Merchants debated priorities. But Hamilton's vision laid the foundation for economic stability and growth, proving that the revolution was not only a political transformation but also an economic one. The United States had to navigate a world still dominated by empires. France, Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands all maintained interests in the Americas. The Jay Treaty, 1794, sought to resolve trade disputes with Britain and prevent war, though it angered many Americans who felt it favored the British. Relations with France remained complex, influenced by the ongoing French Revolution. Western expansion and Native American relations posed continuous diplomatic and military challenges. These early policies revealed the delicate balancing act of a new nation, asserting independence while avoiding entanglement in global conflicts. The early republic was also a time of cultural growth. Education became increasingly valued, with schools and colleges fostering literacy and civic awareness. Newspapers flourished, spreading information and debate to a broad audience. Citizens were encouraged to engage in local governance, volunteer for militias, and participate in community life. The revolutionary ideals of liberty and civic responsibility extended beyond battlefields into daily life, creating a culture of participation, debate, and innovation. Even as the new government solidified, the principles that had guided the 13 colonies remained central. Freedom from tyranny. Representation in governance. The right to self-determination. These ideals inspired ongoing movements within the United States, efforts to expand voting rights, debates about slavery and equality, and the ongoing quest to define what freedom meant in practice. The revolution had not ended with independence. It had sparked a continuing journey, one of experimentation, challenge, and adaptation, shaping the character of the nation for generations to come. The United States looked westward. Settlers pushed beyond the Appalachians, seeking opportunity and land. Treaties and conflicts with Native American nations marked this expansion, creating both promise and tension. The Northwest Ordinance had set a precedent for organized growth, establishing how new territories could become states while preserving rights and encouraging education. The frontier was a testing ground for the new nation's principles, a space where courage, self-reliance, and the revolutionary spirit were essential for survival. From rebellion to independence, from fragile governance to functioning democracy, the 13 colonies had transformed into a nation capable of self-rule. The spirit of the colonies, resilient, courageous, and determined, remained at the heart of America. The lessons learned during revolution and nation-building guided leaders and citizens alike. They proved that freedom is not merely granted, it is fought for, defended, and nurtured. The ideals of the 13 colonies, unity, perseverance, and belief in liberty, continue to inspire Americans and the world to this day. The United States had survived its most perilous challenges. Independence had been won, governance established, economies stabilized, and international recognition achieved. Yet the nation remained dynamic, evolving, and defined by the revolutionary ideals of the 13 colonies. From this foundation, the United States would continue to grow, expand, and inspire, a nation born of courage, forged in struggle, and guided by principles that had first emerged in 13 small settlements along the eastern seaboard. Victory on the battlefield and the establishment of government were monumental achievements. Yet independence did not automatically create equality, justice, or prosperity for all Americans. The young nation now faced an ongoing challenge: building a society that reflected the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and opportunity. The struggle for freedom was not over. It had simply entered a new phase, one fought not with muskets, but with law, debate, and civic engagement. The early republic saw growing opportunities for citizens to engage in government. States expanded voting rights for white men, though property requirements still limited participation in some regions. Town meetings, local elections, and state legislatures became arenas for debate, allowing ordinary citizens to shape policies that affected their lives. Newspapers flourished, spreading information and ideas that informed the public and encouraged political activism. Education played a critical role. Schools and academies emphasized civic knowledge, preparing future leaders to understand both the responsibilities and the freedoms granted by the Constitution. While participation was not universal, these early steps created a culture in which citizens could influence the direction of their country, a radical shift from colonial times, when decisions were imposed from afar. Despite revolutionary ideals of liberty, slavery remained a profound contradiction in the United States. The 13 colonies had diverse economies and societies, but most relied on enslaved labor to sustain agriculture, especially in the South. Debates over slavery emerged immediately after independence. Some northern states began gradual emancipation, recognizing that freedom for all could not be delayed indefinitely. Southern states, however, resisted, arguing that their economies depended on enslaved labor. The issue of slavery exposed the tension between principle and practice. Freedom for some coexisted with oppression for others. The revolutionary generation understood the moral challenge, but compromise would define the nation for decades to come. Slavery was more than an economic institution, it was a central test of the United States' ability to live up to its founding ideals. Women had played crucial roles during the Revolution, managing households, farms, and businesses in the absence of men, and sometimes even supporting armies directly. After independence, women began to advocate for greater access to education, property rights, and civic participation. Figures such as Abigail Adams famously urged leaders to remember the ladies when crafting new laws. While full equality remained far off, the Revolutionary era planted the seeds of change, influencing generations of women to assert their voices in the public sphere. As Americans moved westward, conflicts with Native American nations intensified. Treaties were negotiated, broken, and renegotiated, reflecting the complicated and often tragic process of expansion. The Northwest Territory became a testing ground for American policy toward indigenous peoples. While settlers sought land and opportunity, native nations fought to defend their homelands. These struggles highlighted the tension between revolutionary ideals of liberty and the realities of territorial expansion, a challenge that would shape U.S. policy for generations. The post-revolutionary period saw the development of a uniquely American culture. Writers, poets, and philosophers explored themes of freedom, democracy, and national identity. Newspapers and pamphlets encouraged public discourse and debate. Artists captured landscapes, historical events, and portraits of revolutionary heroes, fostering pride in the new nation. Music, theater, and literature became vehicles for expressing the ideals of liberty and individuality. Through these cultural expressions, the people of the 13 colonies, now Americans, began to see themselves as part of a shared story, united not only by geography but by values and aspirations. The American Revolution had inspired more than political independence, it had sparked a transformation in thought, society, and identity. Ideas of self-government, natural rights, and civic responsibility spread across the population, influencing law, education, and social reform. Revolutionary ideals became a benchmark for evaluating policy, justice, and human rights. Even as challenges remained, slavery, inequality, and conflict with indigenous nations, the revolutionary spirit guided Americans in their ongoing quest to create a society aligned with their founding principles. The 13 colonies had begun as small settlements along the eastern seaboard. They had survived adversity, rebellion, and war. They had created a united nation and experimented with new forms of government. Their legacy endured in many ways. Commitment to liberty and self-determination. Civic engagement and public debate. Cultural expression and education. The drive to expand opportunity and governance across new territories. The foundation laid by these colonies shaped the United States, providing a blueprint for resilience, creativity, and progress. Their story was not merely historical, it was living, influencing every generation that followed. The post-revolutionary era demonstrated that independence was not simply a moment in time, but a process. Social, economic, and political challenges tested the young nation, and the ideals of the 13 colonies guided responses to these challenges. From civic participation to cultural expression, from frontier expansion to the moral questions of slavery, the United States continued to grow, evolve, and pursue the promise of freedom and justice for all. The 13 colonies, once dependent and divided, had given birth to a nation capable of confronting its flaws, aspiring to greatness, and inspiring the world with the enduring power of revolutionary ideals. The story of the 13 colonies is more than a tale of rebellion, war, and independence. It is the story of ordinary people who dared to imagine a different future, a future defined by liberty, self-determination, and the pursuit of justice. From the earliest settlements in Jamestown, Massachusetts, and Georgia, to the battlefields of Yorktown, the 13 colonies forged the principles that would shape the United States for centuries. The adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights ensured that the new nation would not repeat the mistakes of monarchy. Checks and balances prevented the concentration of power. Rights were protected. Laws were established to reflect both local needs and national goals. Through these frameworks, the United States demonstrated that governance could be rooted in principles, not just tradition or force. The system created by the revolutionary generation allowed for flexibility, debate, and adaptation, qualities essential for the survival of any free society. The 13 colonies left a profound cultural legacy. Education and literacy expanded, fostering civic engagement and debate. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books spread revolutionary ideas, connecting people across the new nation. Art, literature, and theater celebrated freedom and explored the meaning of citizenship. Women, though still limited in political rights, began advocating for education and influence in civic life. Communities built schools, libraries, and civic institutions, laying the foundation for a society that valued knowledge, participation, and responsibility. While independence brought freedom for many, it also revealed contradictions. Slavery persisted, indigenous nations were displaced, and women were denied political power. Yet the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, and self-determination, provided a framework for future progress. Abolition movements, women's rights campaigns, and civil rights struggles would all draw inspiration from the principles first fought for in the 13 colonies. The revolution was not a conclusion, it was the beginning of a continuous effort to align society with the ideals of justice and freedom. The influence of the 13 colonies extends far beyond the borders of the United States. Their struggle inspired revolutions in France, Latin America, and across the globe. Their experiments in governance provided models for democratic institutions worldwide. The lessons of courage, perseverance, and principled leadership continue to resonate. The founding ideals remind each generation that freedom requires vigilance, participation, and a willingness to act for the greater good. The 13 colonies were small settlements facing immense challenges, harsh climates, economic uncertainty, and a distant empire. Yet they achieved what few could imagine: independence, unity, and the creation of a nation built on revolutionary ideals. Their story is a testament to the human spirit. It demonstrates that ordinary people, when united by purpose and principles, can shape history. From protest to war, from governance to culture, the 13 colonies forged a path that continues to influence the United States today. The legacy of the 13 colonies teaches us that freedom is fragile and must be defended. It shows that courage, sacrifice, and vision are essential in the pursuit of liberty. It reminds us that governance is a collective effort, requiring debate, compromise, and civic engagement. Most importantly, it affirms that a nation is not simply defined by territory or power, but by the values it upholds, the rights it protects, and the opportunities it provides for all its people. The United States of America was born from 13 colonies, diverse, divided, yet united by a shared belief in freedom. From their struggles emerged a nation that would grow, evolve, and inspire the world. Their story reminds us that history is not just a record of events, it is a living legacy. It is the courage to act, the wisdom to build, and the determination to create a society worthy of the ideals we hold most dear. The 13 colonies gave birth to a nation. The nation continues to strive toward the ideals they first fought to achieve. And their story continues to shape the world.